The sky over Redemption Creek had been torn open, its grey belly spilling a fury of wind and rain that the townsfolk would speak of for generations. When the roaring finally ceased and a bruised, watery sunlight filtered through the clouds, the world was remade in splinters and sorrow. The home where Evelyn had been born, where she had mourned her young husband, and where she now cared for her aging mother, was gone. It hadn't just collapsed, it had been scoured from the earth, its foundations peeled away like the lid of a tin can, leaving only a raw, muddy wound on the prairie. All that remained was the storm cellar, its heavy doors ripped from their hinges, and inside, two women shivering not just from the cold, but from the violent erasure of their lives. Eleanor, at 72, looked at the wreckage with eyes that had already seen too much loss, her face a mask of quiet, final despair. Her world, once again, had been reduced to what she could hold in her trembling hands, which was nothing. But Evelyn, only 24 and a widow for 2 of those years, looked at something else. Her gaze bypassed the ruin, bypassed the concerned faces of neighbors already picking through the debris of their own lives, and settled on the dark, brooding line of the Blackwood forest that bordered the plains. If you think you know what happens next, a collection taken up at the church, a spare room offered in town, a life of dependent gratitude, then you don't know the story of Evelyn Marsh. For what this quiet, unassuming widow did next would defy all logic, challenge the very notion of community, and become a testament to the stubborn, unyielding power of a daughter's love. She took her mother's hand, pulled the thin shawl tighter around the old woman's shoulders, and began to walk, not towards the town, but away from it. Eleanor stumbled beside her daughter, her feet sinking into the soft, rain-soaked earth. "Where are we going, child?" she asked, her voice thin and brittle, like dry leaves skittering across stone. "Sheriff Brody is organizing shelter at the meeting hall. Mrs. Gable said we could stay with her until..." Her voice trailed off, the unspoken words hanging in the air. "Until what? Until we become a permanent burden? Until we are charity cases, living on the scraps of other people's pity?" Evelyn did not answer immediately. She kept her eyes fixed on the tree line, her expression as steady and unreadable as the grey granite cliffs that jutted out from the forest's edge. Her late husband, a man who had preferred the company of mountains to men, had been a prospector. He had spent years combing these woods, not for gold, but for the quiet solitude they offered. He had taught her things that the other women in Redemption Creek, busy with quilting bees and church socials, would never know: how to read the land, how to find shelter where there was none, how to listen to the whisper of the wind and understand its language. He had once shown her the old wolf cave, a deep, dry hollow carved into the base of the cliffs, its entrance hidden by a thick curtain of ancient ivy. A place to wait out a storm, he had called it, or a world that's grown too loud. Evelyn had never imagined she would be returning to it to wait out the wreckage of her own world. When they reached the edge of the forest, she finally stopped and turned to her mother. "We are not going to the town, Mama. We are going home." Eleanor looked from her daughter's determined face to the dark, intimidating moor of the woods, a place of shadows and unseen things. "That is not our home," she whispered, her fear palpable. "Our home is gone." Evelyn's grip on her hand tightened, a small, firm anchor in the swirling chaos of their loss. "Then we will make a new one." Her words were not a plea, but a quiet declaration of fact. The community's reaction was exactly what one would expect. It was a mixture of pity, confusion, and outright disbelief. Sheriff Brody, a good man with a practical mind, rode out to the edge of the woods the next day. He found Evelyn hauling fallen branches away from a dense wall of ivy, her hands already raw and scratched. "Evelyn," he said, his voice gentle but firm, dismounting from his horse. "This is no place for you and your mother. It's wild out here. There are predators. The winter will come." He gestured back towards the distant, hazy shape of the town. "Let us help you. The community will provide. We'll even put together a work crew to rebuild your house come spring." Evelyn paused, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist, leaving a smudge of dirt. She looked at the sheriff, her eyes clear and direct. There was no desperation in them, only a profound and unsettling stillness. "I appreciate your kindness, Sheriff. I truly do. But we will not be a burden. My mother, she has her pride." She did not need to explain further. Everyone knew Eleanor Marsh, a woman who had buried a husband and 3 sons, and had never once asked for a handout. To be reduced to charity now, at the end of her life, would be a different kind of death. The sheriff sighed, seeing the futility of argument in her resolute posture. "It's a cave, Evelyn. A damp, dark hole in the ground. It's not a home." Evelyn turned her gaze back to the ivy-covered cliff face. "Not yet," she said, her voice barely a whisper, carried away by the breeze. "But it will be." He left her there, shaking his head, and the story spread through Redemption Creek like wildfire. The poor Marsh widow had been driven mad by grief and loss. She was taking her elderly mother to live in a cave like a wild animal. Mrs. Gable, the town's self-appointed moral compass, clicked her tongue. "It's a disgrace," she declared to anyone who would listen. "To let her pride lead her poor mother to ruin. She'll come crawling back before the first frost, mark my words." Inside the cave, the air was cold and smelled of damp earth and centuries of stillness. The entrance was a narrow slit, but it opened into a surprisingly large chamber, the size of a decent cabin, with a ceiling high enough for a tall man to stand upright. The floor was uneven, littered with rocks and the debris of ages, and a steady, maddening drip of water echoed from a dark corner, each drop a tiny hammer striking the stone. For Eleanor, it was a tomb. She sat on a smooth, cold rock near the entrance, her shawl pulled tight, watching her daughter work with a sense of detached horror. This was not living, it was a desperate, primal act of survival she thought she had long since left behind. But for Evelyn, the cave was not an end, but a beginning. She saw not darkness, but potential. She saw not a tomb, but a sanctuary. Her husband had taught her to see the bones of the land, and here she saw good bones. The rock was granite, solid and dry for the most part. The main chamber was protected from the wind, and a smaller, secondary chamber off to the side could serve as a larder or a place to store wood. Her first task was the most grueling. With a broken shovel salvaged from the wreckage of their home and her bare hands, she began to clear the floor. She worked with a methodical, relentless rhythm, her movements economical and precise. She hauled out loose rocks, scraped away layers of ancient, impacted dirt, and leveled the ground inch by painful inch. For days, the only sounds were the scrape of metal on stone, her own steady breathing, and her mother's silent, despairing presence. Evelyn did not speak much, pouring all of her energy, her grief, and her fierce, protective love into the physical act of creation. She was not just clearing a cave, she was carving out a space for them to exist, a space where they could be whole and not objects of pity. Every stone she moved was an act of defiance. Every shovelful of dirt was a rejection of the town's well-meaning charity. She was building a fortress not just against the coming winter, but against the slow, creeping death of dependency. The heart of any home, Evelyn knew, was its hearth. It was the source of warmth, the place for cooking, the center around which life revolved. Without it, the cave would forever remain a cold, lifeless cavern. Building a fireplace from nothing, with no bricks and no help, was a task most men would have deemed impossible. But Evelyn remembered the long winter nights spent listening to her husband describe the simple, effective fireplaces built by trappers and prospectors, men who had to make a home from whatever the wilderness provided. The design was crucial. It needed to draw the smoke up and out, not fill the cave with a choking haze. She found a natural fissure in the cave's ceiling, a thin crack that snaked its way up through the rock. It was the perfect flue. Her first step was to build the foundation. She used the largest, flattest stones she had cleared from the cave floor, arranging them in a solid, level base directly beneath the fissure. Then came the search for the right materials. She spent days combing the creek bed that ran through the forest, her eye scanning for stones of a certain size and shape, some flat and wide for the walls, others smaller and more angular to fill the gaps. She carried them back one by one, her muscles screaming in protest, her resolve hardening with every journey. The mortar was her own invention, a recipe learned from her husband's stories. She found a deposit of rich, red clay down by the creek and spent an entire day digging it out, carrying it back in a salvaged bucket. She mixed it with sand and a little water, kneading it with her hands until it had the consistency of thick dough. Then, slowly, stone by stone, she began to build. It was a painstaking process, like solving a puzzle in 3 dimensions. Each stone had to be chosen to fit with the one below it, the gaps filled meticulously with her clay mortar. She built the firebox first, deep and wide, then began to taper the walls inward to form the throat, channeling the smoke towards the fissure above. Eleanor watched from her rock, the silent observer. At first, she saw only a fool's errand, a desperate attempt to ward off the inevitable. But as the structure grew, something shifted within her. She saw the care with which Evelyn selected each stone, the intelligence in the way she angled the walls, the sheer, unyielding force of will that kept her going long after exhaustion should have defeated her. It was not madness. It was engineering. It was love made manifest in stone and clay. The day Evelyn finished, she stood back, her body aching, her hands caked in dried mud. The fireplace was not pretty, it was a rough, primitive thing, but it was solid. It was real. She laid a small fire of dry twigs and held her breath. A wisp of smoke curled upwards, hesitated for a moment, and then was pulled, as if by magic, straight up into the fissure and out of the cave. A warm, golden glow filled the space, pushing back the shadows, and for the first time, the cave felt less like a cavern and more like a room. Eleanor rose from her stone and walked towards the fledgling fire, holding out her hands not just to its physical heat, but to the impossible warmth of her daughter's creation. With the hearth established, Evelyn turned her attention to their second most pressing need, food. The supplies they had salvaged would not last the winter, and relying on trips to town was a compromise she was unwilling to make. An idea had been forming in her mind, another piece of her husband's wilderness law that the townsfolk would have dismissed as insanity. Most of the cave was shrouded in darkness, but there was one spot, in the back of the main chamber, where the ceiling thinned. A different, larger fissure, almost a skylight choked with ancient roots and earth, allowed a single, determined shaft of sunlight to pierce the gloom for a few hours each day. It was a pale, filtered light, but it was light nonetheless. It was here she would make her garden. The task was Herculean. The floor in this part of the cave was solid rock. She needed soil. For 2 weeks, she made endless trips to a small, fertile meadow on the edge of the forest. Using the broken shovel and the single bucket, she dug up the rich, black earth and carried it, load by agonizing load, back to the cave. She was building a plot of land from scratch, a few square feet at a time. She walled it off with a low border of stones to keep the precious soil contained. It was a raised bed, a tiny, defiant patch of prairie inside a mountain of granite. Eleanor, now drawn into the rhythm of their new life, helped her crumble the clumps of earth, her gnarled fingers working alongside her daughter's. In that soil, Evelyn planted the seeds she had painstakingly rescued from their ruined garden, hardy things that could withstand the cool temperatures and lower light. Kale, tough and resilient. Potatoes, which grew in the dark earth. Carrots. And a few precious herbs whose scent, she hoped, would make the cave smell more like a kitchen. To the people of Redemption Creek, the idea of a garden inside a cave would have been the stuff of fantasy, a child's fairy tale. But Evelyn understood that nature was not as rigid as they believed. Life was tenacious. It pushed through cracks in stone, it reached for the faintest light, it clung to existence with a ferocity she now understood in her own bones. While the garden took root, she addressed the need for protein. She had managed to save 3 of their hens, who had miraculously survived the storm. She built them a small, secure coop in the secondary chamber, using woven branches and mud. Their soft clucking was a sound of domesticity, a comforting, everyday noise that fought back against the cave's profound silence. The chickens, the fledgling garden, the warm stone of the fireplace, these were the building blocks of their new world. It was a strange, subterranean existence, governed not by the town clock but by the single shaft of light that crept across the stone floor, a slow-moving sundial that marked the passage of their days. The first snows of winter came early that year, a thick, white blanket that silenced the world and sent the people of Redemption Creek scurrying to the warmth of their wood stoves. In town, conversations often turned to the marsh women. The consensus was grim. No one had seen them in weeks. The path to the woods was drifted over. They had surely given up, or worse. Sheriff Brody felt a heavy weight of responsibility, imagining their frozen bodies discovered in the spring. Mrs. Gable wore a somber, knowing look, telling her neighbors, "Pride is a cold comfort when the north wind blows." She was wrong. Inside the cave, they were not cold. The stone fireplace, a masterpiece of primitive design, drew beautifully and radiated a deep, penetrating heat that warmed the very rock around it. Evelyn had spent the last weeks of autumn gathering a massive pile of firewood, which now stood stacked against the inner wall, a bulwark of security. She had woven thick mats of dried grass and leaves to lay upon the floor, insulating them from the cold stone. She had even fashioned a door of sorts, a heavy frame of woven branches packed with mud and straw, which she could fit snugly into the cave's narrow entrance, sealing them off from the howling winds. The first great blizzard was their ultimate test. For 3 days, the world outside disappeared into a churning vortex of white. The wind shrieked and moaned, a living thing trying to claw its way inside. But in their stone sanctuary, there was only a profound and peaceful quiet. The fire crackled, its light dancing on the stone walls. The chickens clucked softly in their enclosure. The air was warm and smelled of wood smoke and the faint, earthy scent of their tiny garden. Eleanor sat on a stool Evelyn had made from a stump of wood, knitting with yarn salvaged from their old life. She was not just surviving, she was comfortable. She was home. The storm that was a terror to the town was, to them, a distant rumor, a muffled roar beyond their walls. They had everything they needed. The potatoes and carrots from their garden, roasted in the coals of the fire, were the sweetest she had ever tasted. The occasional egg from their hens was a precious gift. They had shelter, they had warmth, they had food, and most importantly, they had each other. They had their dignity. As the blizzard raged, Eleanor looked at her daughter, who was calmly mending a tear in her dress by the firelight. She saw not the half-mad girl the town pitied, but a woman of terrifying strength and quiet genius, a creator who had literally built a world for them out of the rubble. The town thought they were freezing, starving, and defeated. The truth was, they had never felt more secure. When the spring thaw finally came, melting the heavy snows and turning the world to mud and slush, the town of Redemption Creek slowly came back to life. The talk of the marsh women had faded over the winter, replaced by the more immediate concerns of survival. It was generally assumed they had perished. So it was with a sense of collective shock that one morning, Mrs. Gable, on her way to visit a neighbor, saw 2 figures emerging from the Blackwood forest. They were thin, yes, but they walked with a purpose, their backs straight. It was Evelyn and Eleanor Marsh. A hush fell over the main street as they walked towards the general store. They were not begging. They were not seeking aid. Evelyn carried a small basket containing a dozen eggs and a small pouch. She walked to the counter and traded the eggs for a bag of flour and some salt. There was no desperation, only a simple, straightforward transaction. The storekeeper, his mouth agape, could only nod. The women were not just alive, they were self-sufficient. Curiosity, now stronger than pity, began to gnaw at the townsfolk. Mrs. Gable, unable to contain herself, decided she had to see this cave for herself. She feigned a neighborly visit, packing a basket with some bread and jam, and made the trek out to the woods. She expected to find a squalid, miserable hovel. She expected to be vindicated in her judgment. What she found left her speechless. Evelyn led her into the cave, past the sturdy, well-made door. The air inside was not cold or damp, but warm and dry, smelling faintly of wood smoke and roasting vegetables. The fireplace glowed with a low, steady fire. The floor was clean and covered with woven mats. And in the back, under that impossible shaft of light, was a small, thriving garden, its green shoots a vibrant splash of life against the grey stone. Eleanor was there, feeding the chickens in their clean, tidy coop. She looked healthier and more content than Mrs. Gable had seen her in years. There was a purpose in her movements, a light in her eyes that had long been extinguished. This was not a place of miserable survival. It was a home. A strange, unconventional, astonishing home. Mrs. Gable left her basket of bread on a small stone ledge that served as a table and walked back to town in a daze. Her story, told with a newfound sense of wonder, changed everything. The crazy widow's folly was no longer a folly. It was now the wonder of the hollow. The transformation in Eleanor was perhaps the most profound miracle of the cave. The woman who had entered the woods that first day was a ghost, a fragile creature hollowed out by grief and resigned to a future of dependency. The storm had simply been the final blow, shattering what little was left of her spirit. She had seen the cave as her tomb, the final, bleak chapter of a long and difficult life. But the cave, through her daughter's tireless efforts, had become a place of rebirth. She was no longer a passive recipient of care, but an active participant in their shared life. The chickens became her domain. She cared for them with a tenderness that was heartbreaking to watch, naming each one, clucking back at them as she scattered their feed. Their daily gift of an egg was, to her, a small, perfect symbol of their resilience. The garden, too, gave her purpose. She would spend hours by the small patch of earth, weeding and watering, her old, stiff fingers gently tending the new life pushing up towards the light. She watched the slow, steady progress of the kale and the carrots with a proprietor's pride. She, who had thought her useful life was over, was once again a provider, a nurturer. The pride that had once been a brittle, defensive thing, the pride that made her refuse charity, was now forged into something stronger. It was the pride of self-reliance, the deep, soul-satisfying knowledge that they were making their own way, dependent on no one but themselves and the landscape that had taken them in. She began to tell Evelyn stories of her own childhood on the frontier, stories of hardship and ingenuity that she hadn't spoken of in decades. In the flickering firelight of their stone home, the two women forged a bond deeper than they had ever known, a partnership built of shared work and mutual respect. The cave had not been a tomb. It had been a crucible, burning away her despair and leaving behind the hard, pure substance of her spirit. She had walked into the woods to die, but had instead found a reason to live. The news of what Evelyn had built spread beyond the gossip circles of Redemption Creek. Farmers from outlying homesteads, hearing the tale, would ride over to see it for themselves. They came expecting to scoff, but they left in a state of quiet awe. They were practical people, people who understood the brutal calculus of survival, and they could recognize genius when they saw it. They saw the elegant simplicity of the fireplace, how it drew smoke perfectly without a proper chimney. They marveled at the garden, a concept so foreign and yet so logical once you saw it. They saw the cleverness in every detail, the woven door, the insulated floor, the secure chicken coop. They saw a home built not with money or fancy tools, but with intelligence, grit, and an intimate understanding of the natural world. One afternoon, Sheriff Brody rode out again. This time, he did not come to offer charity or to lecture her on safety. He came out of respect. He dismounted and stood at the entrance, removing his hat. Evelyn invited him in. He walked through the space slowly, his eyes taking in every detail. He ran a hand over the rough stones of the fireplace, still warm from the morning fire. He knelt by the small garden, touching a leaf of kale as if to confirm it was real. He was a man of law and order, of plans and regulations. What Evelyn had done defied all of it. It was a solution that could never have been conceived in a town meeting or by a committee. It was the singular vision of one determined woman. He finally turned to Evelyn, his expression one of profound admiration. "I was wrong," he said, his voice sincere. "I thought you were running from the world. But you weren't. You were building your own." He looked over at Eleanor, who was sitting proudly by the hearth, her knitting in her lap. "You've given your mother back her life, Evelyn. That's something no amount of charity from the town could ever have done." His validation was the final brick in the wall of her achievement. She had not sought praise or approval. She had only sought to care for her mother, to preserve their shared dignity. But in doing so, her quiet actions had spoken with a thunderous voice, echoing through the entire community and reshaping their understanding of what was possible. Years passed. The cave home in the Blackwood Forest became a permanent, if unconventional, feature of the landscape. Evelyn and Eleanor lived there, season after season, their lives falling into a simple, sustainable rhythm. They expanded the garden, learning which plants thrived best in the filtered light. They raised a small flock of chickens. They were a self-contained world, a testament to the idea that a home is not a structure of wood and nails, but a space filled with warmth, purpose, and love. Eleanor lived another decade, longer than anyone, including herself, had ever expected. She passed away peacefully in her sleep one winter night, warm in her bed by the hearth her daughter had built for her. She died not as a burden or a charity case, but as a proud and vital woman in the home she had helped create. Evelyn lived on in the cave for many more years, a quiet, solitary figure who became a local legend. People called her the Woman of the Mountain, a title she would have found amusing. She wasn't a mystical creature, she was just a daughter who had refused to let her mother's spirit be broken. The story of what she did became a lesson taught to children in Redemption Creek, a tale of resilience against impossible odds. It was a story about how the most unconventional solution can sometimes be the most profound. It taught them that strength isn't always loud and boisterous, sometimes it is quiet, methodical, and found in the steady, patient placement of one stone upon another. The cave itself outlasted them all, a silent monument to an incredible act of will. Long after Evelyn was gone, hunters and travelers would sometimes stumble upon it, marveling at the crumbling remains of the stone fireplace and the faint outline of a garden bed on the cave floor. They would feel the lingering warmth in the stones, the echo of a life lived with fierce independence and extraordinary love, a life that proved that a home is not a place you are given, but a place you have the courage to build for yourself, even in the darkest of places.